Hi, this is Alex Wiseman from Texas Tech University. I am recording this video with transcription, and I'll send you that because I think it would be a faster and probably more interesting response to your questions than a sort of a typed out response. But you'll have the transcription anyway, so hopefully that's good. So I just wanted to maybe clarify a little bit what I think you're asking for when you talk about university in the marketplace in the commercialization of higher education. If you're talking about the distinction between for-profit and not-for-profit higher education, that's how I'm going to approach it. I think that's what you mean. So when universities are profit-seeking versus when they are not profit-seeking. So we'll go from there. So when I hear commercialization, that's what I think. So you ask, what do you think about university in the marketplace and commercialization of higher education? Why is it important, and who are the key actors who benefits? So higher education is it's obviously different than primary and secondary or basic education, in that it is not compulsory in most education systems worldwide, or any education systems worldwide that I can think of. And there are obviously different levels of higher education that we can talk about, from community colleges, or sometimes they're called junior colleges, or post-secondary training institutes or institutions, to all the way up to, then you have colleges, which are often four-year programs in many countries, and then higher education or universities, which have advanced degrees usually. They're typically, overseen by a Ministry of Higher Education in many countries, certainly not all. They're often decentralized in their management, meaning that there are no real standards for curriculum or resources or other things. And then there's a distinction between private and public higher education institutions. You can have private for-profit, private nonprofit, and most public, I think, are not for profit. So when we're talking about the marketplace of higher education, really talking about competition over students, enrollment, research funding, other sorts of government support, things like that, that might be coming out of either the private sector or out of a public or government sponsored resource. So I think those would be some of the key actors there. What's interesting is that when higher education is privatized, it often can expand in a way that is not necessarily sustainable or benefiting individual students who are enrolling in the institutions, nor really the broader community. An easy example I think of is Mongolia, actually, after the fall of the Soviet Union. Mongolia's higher education system privatized and expanded very rapidly. The demand for higher education in Mongolia was quite large. And so there were a lot of privately owned for-profit higher education institutions that spread throughout the country very rapidly after the fall of the Soviet Union. Enrollment sort of ballooned. There was unfortunately not the same level of benefit as one might expect, because some of it is the simple law of economics with supply and demand. The demand was great, so the supply grew. But as more people were becoming college educated, then the demand for a college education among employers and industry dropped. So the value of that degree upon completion may not have equaled the expense that individuals put into it to pay the tuition. There was also some reporting of price gouging. So because the demand was so high at the beginning, many private universities were overcharging or at least charging beyond the means of the students in that particular context. The commercialization of higher education, just like the commercialization of basic education or primary and secondary education, is sort of fraught with problems, especially if you consider higher education to be, or education in general, including higher education, to be a human right. So Article 26 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights talks about education at the primary and secondary level. It doesn't necessarily talk about it at the higher education level, but it does indicate that education is a human right. And there's been an expansion of the understanding of education to mean lifelong learning or lifelong education. And so one could say that continuous education, or this kind of lifelong education, is perhaps a human right. And if that's the case, then the commercialization of that human right seems to be contradictory to the point of it being a right that someone might say they have access to, or believe they have access to, or should have access to, regardless of their background or their means. This is a broad question, so my answers, I feel, are very broad. But if you think about private universities versus public universities, and different ways that those institutions sort of market themselves, since private institutions usually don't have the same foundation of resources as public institutions do, either because they're owned by an entity and they're for profit, usually in that case, or they might be religiously affiliated, or they would have another reason for not being a government funded or sponsored institution. Their marketing or recruitment efforts are going to be more important to them than they might be to a public institution that has the backing of government resources and a more steady, or in some cases a more guaranteed enrollment. So I think we have to consider those differences. All right, you've asked, what are the challenges for commercialization of higher education, and what changes did our universities experience with the recent 2 decades of commercialization of higher education? Well, again, this is not a small question. So what are the challenges for commercialization of higher education? Well, one is, I think very clearly, and I said this a little bit in my last comment, that when you commercialize higher education and you commodify it, then there's a problem, because it becomes tied to the means of families or individuals. So it does not become, it reduces access, basically. That's a problem, because we know that higher levels of educational attainment have a lot of benefits for both individuals and societies. So it is limiting access to those benefits. It also means that degrees or departments or faculty that are exploring certain subjects will have that restricted based on the commercialization or the commodification of that area. So if you're not teaching or working in an area that has a high potential for profit seeking, like if you're an engineer and you're working on a particular engineering project that can be sold or can be contracted out so that it earns money, it creates a profit for the maybe for the university, maybe for the individual researchers that are working on it as part of the university efforts. If it's not one of those, then it might be phased out, and that is a real tying every educational program in a higher education institution to potential profit is problematic, because it means that some of the most probably significant and important studies in the humanities in particular will often suffer or be closed or shut. And so I think that's probably the biggest challenge I can think of to the commercialization of higher education, is that it reduces the importance of different educational endeavors or disciplines to their profit-making potential, rather than to the broader social or cultural value of those studies. So what do I suggest for the commercialization of higher education? I think I suggest that the privatization of higher education and its subsequent commercialization has to be regulated pretty heavily by the whatever organization oversees higher education in a particular country or community, in order to maintain a balance, to make sure that things aren't being phased out, or things aren't being provided, more resources than others simply because they have a benefit to specific stakeholders rather than a benefit to the broader society. How do we convince those? The next question: how do we convince those who disagree with the concept of commercialization of higher education? Well, I'm not sure that there's convincing folks who are on board with the commercialization of higher education. There is an expectation that higher education will be commodified. In fact, education, more broadly speaking, is increasingly commodified, because we're always, well, I shouldn't say always, many of us are thinking about human capital development as part of the education that individuals receive. Higher education contributes to that, and so it is an important concept for justifying and rationalizing the development and the persistence of higher education in a lot of communities. So even though there are lots of problems with it, I think it would be difficult to convince those who might support the commercialization of higher education to disagree with it. I'm not really sure what this question means. How do you define the nonprofit universities as part of the higher education organization? So a nonprofit or a not-for-profit organization is one that literally doesn't make a profit. So there might be income that's received as part of that organization's functions. Tuition revenue would be one example. But the point is that it's a zero-sum game, right? That there's no more income than there is outcome, I guess, in terms of the financial balance that the university or the organization maintains. It also, I think, is important because nonprofit or not-for-profit organizations are usually organizations that serve their community in a way that for-profit universities do not. For-profit universities usually serve the people who own or manage the university. And so a not-for-profit university would be much more likely to engage in either research or other academic pursuits that are more relevant to the community than they are to simply seeking some sort of income. I think that also answers the second question about what were the next question. What were the reasons behind the establishment or commencement of nonprofit universities? What do I identify as the differences between public universities and nonprofit universities? Well, I mean, you've got nonprofit universities that are both public and private. So I don't think that is a dichotomy. I think that's public is one version of a nonprofit university. You can have a nonprofit university that's private as well. So I would define public universities as those that are sponsored by or supported by the government. And that means that they have usually a mission or a mandate to serve the government stakeholders, which in many societies is the population at large, meaning that there are admission requirements or policies that are reasonable enough to allow a certain percentage of the population to qualify for admission. That means that they would be eligible for funding or other resources from the government itself. It means also that they would be accountable to the government. And they, I think most public universities that at least I work with, and that doesn't mean that's always the case. Most public universities are nonprofit universities. I can't, off the top of my head, think of any public universities that are privatized or that are for profit. Okay, what changes nonprofit experienced over the years? What do you anticipate for nonprofit universities in the future? Well, I'm not sure I have a crystal ball here, so I probably am not going to answer this question very well. I don't really have any predictions for what's going to happen with nonprofit universities. I have more sort of warnings about the privatization or the commodification of education that would be more applicable to for-profit universities rather than nonprofit universities. I'm going to skip down here. You ask, the impacts of COVID-19 and some initiatives such as academic mobility, internationalization home, and cross-border research and education have been enormously troublesome and disruptive. How can and will internationalization adapt to help shape some creative policies in academia? Well, we already know that remote learning and the use of technology in higher education is one of the big outcomes of COVID-19. We also know that COVID-19 and this sort of shift to maybe more remote or technology-driven education has also exposed very long-standing, deep-rooted inequities in society. So remote learning and remote access to education is very much something that is geared towards those who are already technology savvy, who may be in communities or in families that have access to those kinds of resources. So they're probably on the upper income scale, which means that there's a big impact on academic mobility, internationalization, and cross-border research and education, meaning mostly because people will not be traveling. I mean, the physical mobility of individuals is severely restrained by COVID-19 and probably at least should be restrained for the near future, just for health reasons. Internationalization has already shifted to being more based on technology, and you can study abroad at home, basically. The problem is that you can't have the same sorts of informal interactions that are possible in a face-to-face environment. And I think there's a lot of good stuff that comes out of those informal interactions, because as we know, creativity and scientific discovery and sort of the important things that happen around collaborative higher education don't always happen in a prescribed environment, either through something like this, where there's a recording, or synchronous meetings online, or laboratories that are scheduled and conducted online. Those more structured and prescribed experiences don't carry all of the same potential. So creative policies in academia, again, there's going to be more and more of a focus on maybe internationalization that can take place within the virtual atmosphere rather than in the face-to-face or live atmosphere. There'll be more and more an emphasis on synchronous activities online. I think we're already seeing that there is much more targeted academic mobility. Although people are opening up and traveling now probably before they should, it's not going to happen everywhere. So there's a lot more travel that might happen between developed communities worldwide than between developed and developing, or north-south. You might see more north-north transfer than you will north-south transfer or south-north transfer. Okay. I think this question is the same as one I already answered. What are university social responsibilities in the era of COVID-19, and what are the qualities of a successful professor in this period? Holy smoke. Well, university social responsibilities, again, it kind of depends on whether or not we're talking about a for-profit or a not-for-profit, and a public or a private entity. So because we have to define who the society is that the university is responsible to. In the case, I am sitting or standing right now in a public institution in the state of Texas in the United States. My university has a responsibility to the state of Texas, the government of Texas, because that is the funder and the, well, one of the chief funders and sort of the overseer of public universities in our state. So we have a responsibility to the state of Texas. We have a specific responsibility for the health and safety and welfare of the students that we serve and the employees of the institution. There tends to be more of an emphasis in this institution anyway on student welfare and health than on employee welfare and health. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's good that the students are protected and that their health and welfare is a main priority of the institution. We also know that universities have a relationship with their surrounding community. So the local community in which universities are located is a community that they have a responsibility to serve and protect as well, especially in a health crisis like this. So for example, universities like the one that I'm in do a lot to ensure that the student population that is part of the university is not damaging the overall health and welfare of the broader community, either by encouraging vaccination or quarantine or masking or whatever. So those sorts of things are important. Okay, where's higher education going? What are some positive and negative issues with higher education? So I think one of the biggest concerns still for higher education is access. There's still large swaths of the population that are not able to access higher education. And a lot of that is because of the lack of connection or transition between the secondary schools and higher education. A lot of kids, especially those whose parents have not experienced higher education, are not versed or do not have the social and cultural capital in order to make that transition smoothly. This is not a, this is not a local concern. This is a global concern. Higher education is not compulsory. Therefore, it also is not supported in the same way that it would be if it were part of the compulsory or the basic education system. And so I think that's a negative issue, actually. I'm not saying that higher education should be compulsory, but I'm saying that providing additional supports, especially for those who might not necessarily have those supports from their local community or family, is increasingly important. These are not new issues. These are long-term, long-standing issues, but providing that sort of access and opportunity for higher education is very much a key to making sure that not only do individuals succeed in their community and in the labor market, but that whole communities are successful in terms of technology development, social development, political welfare, many other situations or conditions. So those are my thoughts. I hope it's been helpful. Again, thank you for letting me send in this video and transcript as an alternative to typing this all out. Hopefully it's been meaningful, and thanks again for the opportunity.